Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to present this information this morning. The governor's framework for reopening Oregon is designed to be cautious, incremental, and based on science and data. In Oregon, we've flattened the curve, but we know it's not without the sacrifices that you and others have made. The governor's top priority is ensuring the public health and safety of everyone. But at the same time, we know that people are experiencing significant economic hardship. The governor's reopening plan strives to achieve the delicate balance between public health and the health of our economy. Next slide, please. We need to underscore what Dr. Anthony Fauci says. We don't make the timeline, the virus makes the timeline. Next slide. The governor has 6 goals for reopening. The first is to minimize hospitalizations and deaths, to allow people to safely return to work so that they can support themselves and their families, minimize risk to frontline workers, avoid overwhelming health systems, protect those at highest risk of severe illness, especially communities of color, and support for small local gatherings that preserve community cohesion and cultural practices. Next slide, please. It's important to note that even as we reopen, life will look different. We'll be living with the virus until there's a reliable treatment or vaccine, which is many, many months out. Until then, the primary tools that we have to fight the virus are actually pretty low tech and include physical distancing and personal hygiene. Every restriction that we lift will increase transmission and the number of cases. That's why it's important for us to reopen in a thoughtful and safe manner. Next slide, please.
Okay, I'm not seeing any.
There's a statewide face covering policy that I wanted to review real quickly. Businesses where physical distancing can't be maintained are to require employees to wear a mask or cloth material that covers the nose and mouth. Employers are required to provide face coverings to employees. It's recommended that at businesses where employees are required to wear face coverings, that they establish mandatory face covering policies for customers as well. Finally, it's strongly recommended then that when in indoor public places where physical distancing of 6 feet or more cannot be maintained, for the public to wear face coverings. Next slide, please.
You did try to do the Facebook from.
I did.
Throughout all of the phases for reopening, there are guidelines for individuals. They include staying at home if sick or vulnerable, practicing good hygiene, strongly considering wide use of face coverings in public, maintaining physical distance, limited visitation to nursing homes and hospitals, and staying close to home, avoiding overnight trips, and minimizing non-essential travel. Next slide, please. Throughout all of the phases for reopening, there are also general guidelines for all employers. They are knowing the signs and symptoms, understanding transmission, maintaining physical distancing wherever possible, face coverings, implement cleaning and disinfection protocols, training employees, encouraging employees to stay home if sick, and to modify schedules and discourage work travel. Next slide, please. I won't go into great detail for the prerequisites to entering into phase 1. Clackamas County is officially in phase 1 as of last week. Congratulations. But quickly, there are 7 prerequisites that a county or health district must achieve before I enter into phase 1. Some of the prerequisites are measured by county and some by health region. They are a declining prevalence of COVID-19, minimum testing, contact tracing. Next slide, please. Isolation and quarantine facilities for those that can't self-isolate, the need to follow industry sector guidelines, sufficient healthcare capacity, and sufficient personal protective equipment. Next slide, please. Here's a map of the health districts across the state. These health regions were in place prior to COVID-19. Clackamas County is in Health District Region 1, which is comprised of Clackamas, Multnomah, Washington, Tillamook, Columbia, and Clatsop counties. Once a county or region feels that they have met all 7 of the prerequisites for reopening, they may submit an application to the governor's office. The governor's office and the Oregon Health Authority then review the application. And again, Clackamas County is now in phase 1 as of last week. Next slide, please. This table shows changes allowed for specific employers in different phases. The middle column represents guidelines that apply statewide for outdoor recreation, retail stores, childcare, summer school camps, youth activities, and takeout only restaurants. The right-hand column applies to counties in phase 1. These are the activities that are allowed in phase 1 under guidelines: restaurants and bars, personal service providers such as nail and hair salons, malls, gyms, local gatherings of no more than 25 people with the need to maintain physical distancing. Next slide, please. Given time constraints, I won't go over all of the sector-specific guidelines in detail. Instead, here are some examples of the types of guidelines that exist. For restaurants and bars, ensure that tables are spaced at least 6 feet apart so that at least 6 feet between parties is maintained. Require all employees to wear cloth, face, or disposable coverings, and end all on-site consumption of food and drinks by 10 p.m. Retail, limit the number of customers and maintain at least 6 feet of distance between people and employees in the store. Frequently clean and sanitize work areas, high traffic areas. Require all employees to wear face coverings. Prohibit customers from trying on items that are worn on the face. And if reopening fitting rooms, customers should wash hands or hand sanitize before and after. Some examples of the guidelines for personal services include appointments and pre-appointment health check required, including maintaining a customer log, 6 feet of physical distancing between clients, removing all magazines, newspapers, snacks, and beverages from waiting areas, and again, the use of face coverings, capes, and smocks required by employees and for clients, depending on the services provided. Common themes throughout these sector guidelines and all other sector guidelines include physical distancing, increased cleaning, sanitization, face coverings, and keeping an eye out for symptoms. Next slide, please. This is a list of the types of establishments and activities that are not allowed in phase 1. Public schools, museums, zoos, aquariums, venues, amusement parks, indoor party places, contact sports courts, playground equipment, and gatherings over 25 people. Next slide, please. There are metrics that we don't want to trigger in order to avoid the need to move to an earlier phase of reopening. The metrics are an inability to meet contact tracing requirements, must be able to contact 95% of contacts within 24 hours. If more than 30% of cases can't be traced to existing cases, this is cause for alarm and indicates widespread community transmission. The second metric is evidence of increasing prevalence of COVID-19 as measured by a 5% or greater increase in cases over 7 days. The third metric is evidence of increasing burden of severe COVID-19, an uptrend of new hospital admissions over 7 days. If any of these metrics are triggered, it's possible that there will be a move back to an earlier phase, but there won't be an automatic reversal. The Oregon Health Authority will first consult with local public health before determining the best course of action. Next slide, please. The details of phase 2 are still unknown. The specifics will be informed by the experience and information gathered in phase 1. After at least 21 days in phase 1, counties that continue to meet the prerequisites may be able to enter phase 2. Some examples of things that may be included in phase 2 include an expanded gathering size of up to 100 people and some office work. But again, these are to be determined and the specifics are still being worked out. Phase 3, next slide. Phase 3 won't happen until there's a reliable treatment or vaccine, which is many, many months out. Therefore, all large gatherings should be canceled or modified to a smaller size through at least September. Smaller size being less than 25. Further guidance on large gatherings for later in the fall will be provided this summer. Concerts, live audience, sports, conventions, festivals won't happen until there's a reliable treatment or vaccine. Next slide. This chart is a recap or summary of the phases and what's allowed in each phase. The type of activities allowed gradually increase in risk level with each phase. You must be in each phase for a minimum of 21 days and meet the prerequisites for reopening before advancing to the next phase. I'll close by saying that the governor continues to coordinate with her fellow West Coast governors. They're in regular communication, consult with one another, and share best practices and information. While there's coordination among these Western states, there are areas where we may differ given our individual states' unique situational needs. Finally, you may find information and resources about the reopening and industry sector guidelines on the governor and the Oregon Health Authority's web pages. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
I would like to mention that thank you very much, Raihana. There are a couple of housekeeping things that I neglected to say at the beginning. One is that the recording is, this webinar is being recorded. However, the Facebook page, it didn't work out. So that won't be done. I also wanted to mention that we have a co-host, Sherry Henson, who is going to be moderating the questions and answers and consolidating them. And we expected that most of the questions and answers would be taken care of at the end of all of the presentations because some presenters may already ask them. My understanding is that all the panelists can see the questions and answers at the bottom of their screen or their device so they can do Q&A on those. The other thing is, I did need to introduce our president. I had a little technical difficulties, but he's back online now. And Kent, I'm going to unmute you now if you'd like to say hello and greet our panelists. No, your lips are moving, but nothing's coming out. Stand by. There.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'd like to thank all the panelists that were willing to join us today. It's a real pleasure to actually be reaching out to our Oregon City Business Alliance membership and others from the Oregon City Chamber, as well as the downtown business associations. We're really looking forward, though, to getting back into the Abernathy Center. Hopefully next month we'll be able to do that if we can continue to make progress from phase 1 into phase 2. But I did want to just mention, I don't know if Raihana did an introduction, but she works for the governor's regional solutions team for the Tri-County area, and prior to that, worked for the Portland Business Alliance for 4 years in the governor or the office. Our next, would you like me to introduce our next panelist?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, next we have Matthew Green, who's the Senior Policy Advisor for the Oregon Health Authority.
Unmute myself. Can you hear me now? If you nod.
Thank you.
Yep, it seems to work. All right, I was asked to talk for just a couple of minutes about some of the data, what we're seeing in the numbers, and then I'll stick around for questions later. In the big picture, we have just under 4,000 positive cases in Oregon, 3,861 to be precise as of yesterday, and 148 deaths. Both of those figures are in the low end per capita among states. Depending on which statistic you're looking at, we're around 5th or 6th lowest, which is a good thing. We want to keep it that way. Raihana mentioned vulnerable populations, so I want to talk for just a moment about those and some of the stats there. Couple of factors that get into that, and we're actually working on some more detailed guidance, but this is the big picture. It comes down to people who are most vulnerable to this virus are older people and people with underlying medical conditions. So older, what do I mean by that? First of all, be clear that that doesn't mean that younger people cannot get it. They can't. They can contract the virus, they can transmit the virus, they can get ill from the virus. But the numbers also tell us that the people who get sick and get particularly sick, and especially the deaths, are overwhelmingly skewed toward older populations. In absolute terms, the most number of cases in people is people in their 30s to 60s, but per capita, the most cases is actually people in their 80s or above. And that's even more so in terms of hospitalizations. The largest absolute terms is people in their 60s, and then again, per capita, even older is more. And then in deaths, nearly half of the deaths are people who were 80 or above. In many cases, this is outbreaks in nursing homes or other terms of long-term care facilities, which is one of the biggest challenges and difficulties that we're having, is that once it gets into one of these kinds of facilities, it can be devastating to a population of people within who are all kind of older and possibly ill. The other group, which somewhat overlaps, is people who have underlying medical conditions. What do we mean by that? It's generally things like heart disease of some kind or lung disease, kidney, liver, diabetes, obesity, chronic long-term conditions that broadly bring someone's health down and bring their immunization or their immunological system down, weaken it. The same kinds of things that you might know, people who've died of pneumonia. It might not really be pneumonia so much as the combination of pneumonia and a long-term underlying lung condition, for example. And this is very much the case with people who have this disease. That's not the only association we've seen. We've also seen very much an association or a disproportionate outcome in terms of race and ethnicity. And this is not so much people who, because any particular race or ethnicity is more likely to, like some kind of genetic reason why we might get it, it's built around basic structural and institutional bias and racism in the way things work. The same reason things that you see in terms of health in general, in wealth, in access to healthcare, all of these things are in public health statistics that we look at on a whole variety of issues, from maternal mortality to diabetes rates to everything else, are associated with race and ethnicity. So it was no surprise from a public health perspective to see that this was too. It's the outcome of things like what kind of workplace do you work at? In an office where you can sit somewhere and isolated from other people, versus, let's say, a processing facility of some kind where you're 2 feet from the person next to you all day long, or a home healthcare worker working with a number of older and maybe elderly people in close contact to them, which that kind of situation creates a greater chance of spreading the disease, which helps to explain, maybe not all of it, but helps to explain why, for example, the rates, per capita rates, the highest in the state are Pacific Islander, after that Hispanic, American Indian, Alaska Native, Black, Asian, and then finally white in terms of race and ethnicity. Again, this is a pattern we see in many situations, many health conditions, and it definitely has showed up here. It also shows up for the same reason geographically in places in the state. We have some data on zip codes. In places with higher populations of communities of color, we see it more. Also, the long-term care facilities, when there is an outbreak, we see those pop up in a particular zip code. But it's not evenly distributed, is the short answer, for both the kind of explicitly health reasons and race and ethnicity reasons. So with that, I'll wait for questions later.
Thank you very much, Matthew. There were some other housekeeping things. For example, if you have a PowerPoint display, as Raihana, thank you very much, did, we will try to make those available to our membership and to our mailing list. So we'll have those available. Maybe we'll put a link or something on our website to them as well. So if there are any additional questions about that, let me know. I have questions too, and I'm just biting my tongue not to ask them right now. So rather than get blood all over my tongue, and Kent is back. Kent, did you want to move on ahead?
Yes, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, if I could. We are very honored to have our mayor of Oregon City with us today. Mayor Holladay, I know you have a lot of information you probably are anxious to share now that Clackamas County has been given the approval for phase 1 reopening on various type of stimulus plans or grants that the city might be able to offer our local businesses. So I will turn it over to you.
Trying to unmute you here, Dan. Mayor Holladay, you were giving us instructions about using your space bar earlier. The challenge with my unmuting you is it doesn't seem to be working. Well, maybe we need to move on to our next speaker, and then we'll come back and pick up Dan later. So, Kent, would you like to
Sure,
move on?
sure, you bet. Well, we're going to actually stay with the mayors. I'd like to introduce our former mayor, Dan Fowler. We're very excited to have Dan a part of the Oregon City Business Alliance as the vice president and owner of the Abernathy Center, where we hold our monthly forums. So I've asked Dan to kind of comment on his experiences this far in getting the PPP funding, but more importantly, how he plans to move forward with the reopening of their facilities.
Well, thank you, Kent. It's been quite a journey. You know, we've been through a lot of ups and downs over the last 40 years in various businesses, and this has probably been one of the most challenging times. And I'm going to speak a little bit about what we're going through here and a little bit about where we're moving to. And I want to recognize that obviously we're not the only business in this. And I will say that there's, out of any difficult time, there's always things that you learn. And we've learned a lot about teamwork and working together and finding solutions. What's interesting is most people think of us as an event center or a venue, and yes, we are, but we're also classified as a restaurant. So our business is kind of a tweener right now. We don't know whether we're a foot or horseback. We don't know. We can, if we follow the guidelines as a restaurant, which we are licensed as a restaurant, our insurance is as a restaurant, our workers' comp is as a restaurant, we get a health inspection as a restaurant, and we follow all OCBA and food handling rules as a restaurant. So I've been in discussions with the state and with the committees at the various levels, and they agree that we're a restaurant. We're classified as that. So using that, it's interesting as a business, then what does that mean? Now, we've been working diligently with our sales crew and our general manager and developing different guidelines for how we really operate under the state guidelines. And we're confident that we can. We can follow all of the rules that they've laid out. We believe in doing things safely, absolutely, for our employees, as well as our guests. It's critical that both those groups have confidence that things are okay, that they can return to work and it will be safe for them, or that as a guest I can come to a wedding and it will be safe for me. That's just absolutely critical. None of us in any business want to make an error in judgment in that realm and have a setback or have something happen to an individual. To that end, we've developed how we serve meals. Obviously, there's no buffets, everything's served. I was at a restaurant. I did go to Bend this weekend and I not travel locally. I drove, I traveled over to my daughter's for her birthday. But we went out, to a restaurant. And it was interesting because, I've been knee deep in all these guidelines for the last, weeks. So here I am finally sitting in a restaurant and I'm just analyzing everything that's going on around me. Yes, the booths, you have every other booth empty. Tables are 6 feet apart. They wipe down the salt and pepper shake before they put it on the table because we're all sitting around as an associated party. We can have up to 10 people as associated party. There was 8 of us. But it's interesting reading the guidelines and then starting to live the guidelines. And I can tell you it felt pretty good to get out, to be honest with you. And I felt safe. People were very respectful. People understand that they're needing to keep distance. All of the employees had masks on in the restaurant. The very few patrons had masks, which they're not required. So that was an experience. And those are the kind of things we're doing here at the Abernathy Center. It's just getting ready to do that very same thing. And what's been tough, to lay off 32 people. That was tough. What's tough was lay off 2 full-time chefs I've had for 17 years. Reduced my sales staff. So one of the, there's a balance between the health and the health of an economy that we're all trying to achieve. What's going to feel good? What's going to feel good is to hire them back. We did get the PPP program. As a landlord of other tenants and then myself, we've been feeding every bit of information we can to everybody we know. And we've helped a number of them apply, answer questions. I'm not an expert. We got Rob for that. But, we've helped a lot of them in that process. Many of them made them aware of the city program in that process. They've got now the EDIL loans, some of them. So it's really been a kind of a coming together and working together to make things happen. So, that's just a little bit about what we're going through. Happy to answer questions as they might come up as a business owner. Let me just see if there's anything else I wanted to touch on. I will say that we've been very fortunate. We do a lot of weddings, but we tell people we do 1 wedding a year, which is there. So by doing a number of weddings, I don't want to come across like we don't care about any wedding. We care about every one of them. We've been fortunate in that we've had about 1/3 of the weddings move to later this year. We've had about 1/3 of the weddings move to next year, and about 1/3 of the weddings cancel for various reasons. Some people lost their jobs for COVID and they can't pay for a wedding. There's a lot of reasons. But I'll tell you what, it's pretty tough. When March 14th, 15th came around and we had a bride scheduled for a wedding on March 18th. That was a pretty tough conversation with the bride saying, hey, you can't have your wedding, holy smokes. So I'll tell you one thing it's really caused me to do as a business owner, though, is to really look at how we do communicate with everyone and understanding how it really works as a business. And I can get into that a little bit later maybe, but sometimes as a business, you're caught between satisfying the customer and staying alive. And what I mean by that is there's been a number of weddings and most people have been great, just awesome to deal with. And we have a sales staff that is second to none. They've worked with the brides so well in understanding their situations. But some people they have to stop. And so we work with them on getting their money back as much as possible and all those kind of things. So, but, and I'll just say this as a business, and I don't mean to sound ungrateful, because I would rather have the weddings moved than canceled. But it extends the cycle of loss, because everyone that moves to next year is a date we don't book next year. We've already booked it. And I'm grateful that they've moved and we're not refunding. And there's a 2-year period for us in the event industry to get out of this, at least, because if you've already booked the date in May of this year and then move to May of next year, you don't get booked that date again. And yet you're thankful that they're not leaving you totally. So, but I'm anxious to get back and going. We're working through all the guidelines. We'll follow the rules. And I'm with you, Ken. I hope we can have the, OCBA. As far as I'm concerned, we can have the OCBA meeting in June because we're legally to do that. We're legally able to do that. So that's it. Unless there's questions, I'll stop and we'll move on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dan. And I just want to harp back on the housekeeping. We're pretty much on schedule. We're trying to allow about 10 minutes for each speaker. So since we're already past 12 o'clock, and had 3 speakers, so we're pretty much on target. And let's see if we can stay that way. And the mayor is back. Let me see if I can unmute him this time. And Mayor Holladay, are you back?
I am.
Welcome back.
Sorry, I had to step out for a minute. I was a little too angry to be having a conversation after those 2 earlier presenters. It seems to me that the state has failed dramatically on a couple of things. And one of them, first of all, and there is absolutely no excuse for this, is the disaster at unemployment. I've probably gotten 100 calls from citizens in Oregon City who say, I can't get unemployment, no one answers the phone, no one answers emails, the system doesn't work, how can you help me? And I say, call Mark Meek and Alan Olson, they're your state reps, and see what they can do. But we have heard not one peep from the governor on this issue, not one peep from the lady who is running the employment department. I don't understand. How come these folks can't communicate? This is supposed to be the most transparent administration ever, and yet we can't get the governor to say one little thing about why this disaster at unemployment has happened. The governor was the Secretary of State, did an audit in 2015. They actually got money in 2011, $80-some million from the federal government to fix this, and nothing has been done. Now, we live in the Silicon Forest. Intel is right down the street. There are probably 50,000 young kids who could write an app to fix unemployment in a month, and yet nothing has been done. So that's my number one thing, is that the state has failed our citizens miserably in the unemployment situation.
Excuse me. What I think the audience was looking for is, what is the city doing, and what actions have we taken as a city to alleviate some of the business problems?
Well, the city's done the best we could. We put out $200,000 in small business grants to folks who had a business license for at least a year inside the city. Those businesses had to be 15 or fewer employees, including the owners. Once again, the state hasn't done anything as far as helping small businesses. All of that has been coming from the feds, basically. So we've done the best we can. I have spoken out about getting open, and what I got for it was a letter from the Attorney General telling me I shouldn't be talking to other mayors. And that's something I'll address legally, sometime down the road. But we've done everything we can in the city to try to help as much as we can. We aren't like Gresham or Hillsborough and have, an extra $1 million or $2 million laying around to give out to our small businesses. And in fact, if you're in other places, like I'm sitting in Canby right now, Canby had no money to help our small business community. And it's devastated downtown Canby. It's currently starting to devastate downtown Oregon City. I noticed I drove through Main Street a day or two ago, and there was a karate studio that has completely emptied out and is no longer in business. And the longer this draws out, the longer this drags out, the more economic damage is going to happen. The fact is that if you look at other states that have opened, they aren't seeing dramatic increases in cases. Not Florida, not Georgia, not Texas. And there were some states that never closed. and aren't seeing, dramatic increases. So it seems to me that the state is dragging their feet. For what reason, I am not quite sure.
So Oregon City particularly is taking what actions?
Well, we've taken the actions like I just said. We've had the small business grant. Beyond that, we're following the state guidelines. Some of the guidelines don't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense with a virus that does not survive well outdoors in the sunshine. Why we have playgrounds closed, playground equipment closed. The fact is that the kid, those, especially that age group of kids, don't get it to any kind of, it's no worse than the average common cold for kids under 14. So why are we limiting all these choices? I keep hearing it's all based on science and health and all that, but the evidence doesn't show that. The facts don't show that. And we're killing our economy based on fear.
That's the past. Let's do the future.
So what future do you see for Oregon City's involvement in Rio?
Well, I don't have the support of my commission to go against the governor's orders. Until I do, we'll continue to follow. Hopefully, the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the Constitution and say that those orders were no longer valid as of April 28th, and we can all go back to work.
With no restrictions?
I think we underestimate the intelligence of our citizens. And I think that they have heard about this nonstop now for 8 weeks, and they will take the precautions that they deem necessary to take care of themselves and their family and their friends. My mom is 90, will be 91 in September. She's in an assisted living home in Westland, Tanner Springs. They did, at the very beginning, they locked down. I haven't been able to physically see her for about 7 weeks. But, so people, that's the population we need to be very, very careful of and take care of. Certainly Betty and I are right at the edge of that, age range and health-wise. And I stopped letting Betty see our granddaughter, Savannah, about a week after this whole thing started, because we didn't understand how it was transmitted. We didn't understand how deadly it was and all of those sorts of things. Since then, we've been going back and seeing our granddaughter now for about 3 weeks because we know where she's been, we know where we've been, and so we're not scared of that. And the fact is that especially the death rate for this illness is extremely low, 0.002 to 0.0045. That doesn't justify the economic damage we're doing to our state and our region.
Okay, thank you very much for your help today. Kent, would you like to be introducing our next speaker, please? Because we're still right on schedule. Thank you very much.
Okay, great, William. I appreciate it. Yeah, our next speaker will be Rob Campbell, who is the director for the Small Business Development Center at Clackamas Community College. He was chosen to that position back in 2011 and has since really done an amazing job in conjunction with some of the other departments at the college in offering some unique training programs, internships, where companies actually put very expensive equipment on site so that these students can be trained. I've known Rob for a long time and have a lot of respect for his abilities. So Rob, kind of let us know what the community college is doing now to try to help develop new skill sets for individuals that are unemployed.
Thanks, Kent. Thanks for your kind words. Yeah, Kent and I go way back. I mean, way back even to Hawaii, huh, Kent? Yeah. Well, I'm happy to be here today, and I've got a lot of information, resource stuff that I want to share. I've got some websites. And before I get into specifics, most people know this, but a lot of people don't. We've always said we're kind of like a best kept secret, but the SBDC network was formed in the United States after our depression in the early 80s. Congress got together and said, okay, all the multinationals are moving offshore, chasing cheap labor, and that leaves all the small business community as identified by businesses that have less than 500 employees, which by the way is about 95% of the 15,000 businesses we have in Clackamas County. So we have 19 SBDCs in the state. 17 of us are affiliated with community colleges. There's 3 in Portland, PCC, Mount Hood, and ourselves. We have about 140 advisors in 43 different locations. And I know what you're saying. How do you keep 140 people up to speed on all these changes that have happened in the last 9 to 10 weeks? And I'll explain some of that to you. We serve about 1,200 clients a year at our center in Clackamas. I'm part of the Connections with Business and Industry division. I think a lot of you know Lisa Davidson. She is my adult supervisor. We have 3 different people in, we have the SBDC network, we have workforce development, and we have customized training. And we are kind of the face of the community college to the business in Clackamas County. We have about, out of the 1,200 or so clients that we serve, half of them have a business and half of them want to start a business. And we have a guided pathway for both of those people. We focus in 4 or 5 areas. Veterans, number 1, I got my job at the college because of my veteran status. Contractors are a big group that we have. We have one class that's got 51 different companies in it. Entrepreneurship, innovation, and small farm succession planning. Most people don't know this, but Clackamas County's got 3,000 small farmer razor growers. 2,000 of them are 60 years old and older. And we started a program about 4 years ago to see if we could deal with that. Fortunately for the SBDC, we were at about 90% capacity before the pandemic hit. So we had to figure out an appropriate response because we are partnered with SBA and Business Oregon to do the frontline response on the CARES Act, which you've all heard about. So the emergency injury loan and the PPPL loan. One goes directly to SBA. The EIDL loans go directly. All the PPPL. Sherry's on the call. Good to see you, Sherry. From a banker's perspective, all of the PPPL loans go through Sherry. There's also a $25,000 emergency loan that goes through there. And just as a plug to Sherry and Columbia Bank, I've known Scott Boston for a long time, even when he worked for SBA. Columbia Bank is the #1 SBA lender in this region. And I'm sure they have been very busy. And I've talked to Luther Barker and Scott multiple times since this thing happened. So I told you about our focus areas, but we also have staff support in different areas. One is customized training. You know, we talk about that. We talk about workforce development. I'm going to show you a site, and I'm going to send Kent and William the links of the things that I'm going to share. So people that are on this call and to the general membership of the Oregon City Business Alliance will have access to these resources. We have staff support and capital access. We have a CAT team. We have a global trade center. We have a lot of people that have actually explored exporting, even in this time period, to other countries. We have cybersecurity and we have market research available to us. We were getting ready for accreditation. We go through accreditation at the college. We go through accreditation from the National SBDC network in the United States. And we were getting ready. So we've been doing distance delivery for 4 or 5 years now. So in order to move all of our programs to remote, virtual teleconferencing was relatively easy for us. Our first line of response, though, is to direct people to where the resources are. And so I have some sites here. I'm going to share my screen with all of you. And I'll start with, see if I can find it here. Let's see. Well, I don't see either one of them here. So let's see. I need to find, and let's see, select the one there. So just a minute here, be patient with me. I'll talk while I'm messing with my computer. So I'm going to pull up this one, and then I'll go back. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, I'm going to start out with the college. I've got a few minutes here. If you go to the Clackamas Community College and go to the academics piece, you will actually you'll find a COVID-19 landing page on how we are dealing with our students. I think you've all heard we're going on our 10th week of being locked out at the college, and so they've decided spring and summer, and last week they said fall classes are all going to be some kind of distance delivery, whether it's online or whether it's remote, virtual teleconference or whatever. But I wanted to show this screen because if you went to the Clackamas website and went to academics and look for skills development and training, I'm hovering my cursor over that, you'll see connections with business and industry, customized training, small business development center, and then workforce services. In partnership with the Clackamas Workforce Partnership, we have been doing exactly employment and development services for a long time. Probably started with like in the transition from a natural resource economy to more of a service economy. So Blue Heron, when it shut down, a lot of people. Westland Paper, when it shut down, fortunately it's back up and running. But you can actually read through this, and it shows you some of the resources for people that have been laid off or need some additional support. I'm going to, I want to show you this site. This is bizcenter.org. We do have a COVID site. And if you go there, I'm going to see if I can, may not work here. Anyway, if you go to this COVID site, you will see the resources that are available from the SBA, Business Oregon, and other communities that, like Dan was talking about, some of the grants. There's also information on there on about how to deal with an economic crisis. There's kind of a checklist or so. There's information in there about summary sheets on some of all the programs, and I'm not going to get into all the details with the banks, but and with SBA lending, but I will tell you, this is the first time in my business career where I have seen this amount of resources available, either through the EIDL loan program, through the Paycheck Protection Program, and the unemployment stuff that Dan was talking about. So I also mentioned our Capital Access Team. If you go to BizCenter CAT, Capital Access Team, CAT.org, our first line of response is sending people to the bizcenter.org, click on this website, kind of pre-qualify themselves, and then come back to our center for one-on-one counseling. That's no cost to the client. If we have more elaborate capital access need, we actually refer people to our capital access team. So that's the second phase. And I also want to show let's see if I can find it here. If you go to either the college website and look for the SBDC, Small Business Development, and a shortcut to that is go to bizcenter.org and look for the different centers located around the state of Oregon. If you click on Clackamas, you will find our center, and you will find information about our team. But if you want or know anybody in the business community that wants to have a one-on-one confidential advising session with one of our business advisors, you just fill out this form. And it just puts in some basic information, and you get that, and then we will actually follow up with you and have a more conversation with us. It also talks about some of the stuff that's happened to us in the past. I think that's all I've got.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. I noticed that Representative Drazan has arrived. She's going to be our next speaker. So Kent, did you want to do an introduction? And where did Kent go? And there he is. Kent, would you like to give an introduction to our representative? And thanks for being so prompt, Christine.
Kent's on mute.
Oh, Kent's on mute. Hold on a second.
I think I'm muted off now.
You're unmuted.
Okay, well, Christine, thank you for joining us. I know you had an earlier appointment today, and you were fortunately able to go ahead and get online with us here a few minutes ago. Obviously, this has been a crazy time down in the legislature. Our mayor had a few comments about his response to the unemployment claim situation. Maybe you can touch a little bit on anything you might know of what's being done to try to help out that center process more of the claims, but mostly just wanted to get your thoughts on what is the talk down in Salem right now as to how we can help local businesses open up safely and profitably.
Thank you, Kent. It is great to be here today. I am going to preface my comments by saying, out in rural Clackamas County, my Wi-Fi isn't always awesome. So if I freeze in some weird facial position, please don't hold it against me.
We'll take a screenshot.
Yeah, right. Be kind. Be kind. So I'm going to jump right in. I last week had a really lengthy conversation. I'm just going to start at employment department stuff really quickly. I have spent over an hour on the phone with the director of the employment department to hear from her about what their plans were and how they were going to begin to change processes to be more responsive. They were still lingering at 45,000 unresolved cases. I think today they're down to about 38,000. And today she released their plans for how they're going to expedite resolution of those claims and how they're going to change business practices to start to move through those claims faster. The problem that I've had all along with the employment department is this idea that business as usual has been okay and that they can just hire more people and somehow these antiquated systems are going to be more responsive than they've ever been before. I mean, we had record unemployment for a decade, down at 3-4% in the last handful of years. And so their agency just was not prepared. They were not ready to be nimble. And I feel like they've heard from folks on both sides of the aisle calling on them to improve their practices. And I think that we are going to see some progress. My concern for them remains that the work share program is going to get additional use from public entities. Now that there's federal money and Portland Public Schools or local districts don't have to pay their portion into that work share, and there's federal money now that makes it kind of a free program to be able to save money, that's going to apply a lot of pressure again on limited staff resources at the employment department. And I just wanted to make sure people who are fully unemployed didn't get pushed to the back of the line while they are taking care of furloughed workers that are still working 4 days a week. And the furlough was a way for local governments to save a little bit of money. And so it was a priority for me to begin to make sure that the employment department knew that really we have all been patient with them. We know this has been a struggle for that agency, but that they need to step up. And I think that they are going to begin to do that now. From the state's perspective, we do not have a clear date for when the governor may call us in to a special session. That continues to be a conversation. The 2 minority caucus leaders meet with her jointly once a week, and we go through whatever's on her agenda, whatever's on our agenda. And as you can imagine, every week, potential special session comes up. And we do not have clarity from her yet on how she wants to approach that. Now that we have the revenue forecast, though, we do know the size of the problem, $2.9 billion, about 1.9 of that is general fund and lottery dollars. And And her options to resolve that are an allotment. You guys might already know this process, but should the governor choose not to call us in, she then would have to make cuts across the board in all agencies equally to get us back in balance. And I don't think that's the right approach. I don't think that's how we should be prioritizing right now. I think we should be way more strategic and careful about who gets cut and at what level and who gets saved, because we know that this is a different kind of recession than we've seen before, since this was caused by this pandemic and the response to the pandemic to shut down businesses and to ask people to stay home is very different than anything else we've faced. And so I think the response and how we rebalance needs to reflect that. And it needs to reflect an emphasis and a focus on, from my perspective, protecting jobs, maintaining business supports, and rebuilding our economy. I think the balance has got to shift from entirely public health to public health and. Needs to be an and moment for us now. And I think Oregonians have shown that they understand what's required of them for social distancing and hygiene. And businesses are being responsive to new guidance and they're doing their best to keep workers and their customers or clients safe and healthy. And within that context, we need to start to test it a little bit more and try to regain footing for our economy, or we're going to cause permanent damage. And that's the warning we keep hearing from our state economists and others to the state and to state leaders. Do everything you can to avoid permanent damage to your economy. And we need to take that seriously. He knows what he's talking about. And so we have been really anxious to get into a moment where we can begin to invest more and provide more supports for business. Right now, there's $10 million that the state has set aside for business. And it's already gone out in rounds 1 and 2 through Business Oregon in their Emergency Business Assistance Matching Fund. And the first round was for eligible cities and counties and economic development districts. And that was $2.5 million total that was eligible and that they set aside for that program. They had, as I understand it, over $44 million of applicants, of need. And so that was, I believe, 47 applicants and $44 million in need for a $2.5 million fund. So there's some need out there. But the good news is that these entities are providing supports to businesses right now. There's quite a few cities in my district that immediately reached out to their business community and said, we're going to take some money out of our local general fund and we're going to pay rent for 2 months, or we're going to, they really, really reached out to the business community and said, we want to keep Main Street operating. And so thankfully some of this money went to some of those entities. The next round is $5 million, and that is for community development financial institutions. This round is open now, May 22nd through this Friday, May 29th. And this is intended to go through the CDFIs to small businesses, solos, and the folks who didn't get PPP. And so from the state's perspective, that $10 million is what we have done so far in direct payments. Of course, Business Oregon and all you folks are well aware of what's always been out there from the perspective of Business Oregon to support business. And that hasn't changed in this moment. It hasn't shrunk. It hasn't stopped operating. That's still all out there. But the $10 million was new. So I wanted to kind of flag that money's going to go quick, and it's not very much. Really, the depth of opportunity here is federal, and I think that the numbers as it relates to Business Oregon, I'm anxious to see what the final numbers are. That was just a first round from my staff, so we'll see if that was right or wrong. So my apologies in advance if I'm mistaken on any of the applicant numbers. So we'll have to see what comes out from that. The next thing I wanted to talk about just really briefly was when I talked about how the state economist suggested to legislative leaders, please do what you can to get this economy going again. He talked about a couple of things. He talked about investment in infrastructure. And when we go into the legislative session, that's the time where we could do that. invest in roads and capital construction. And that's really the place where the state can really offer assistance and be a bridge to some additional economic activity, is through some of those bonding projects. I actually think this is the right time to do that kind of work. Borrowing will be very low over time, relatively speaking. The cost for borrowing will be. And the state can fill that role and keep some of those projects going. They also suggested this is a good time to expand rural broadband. As we have gone to distance learning for our students, it has really, really shown that we have real gaps in access right now. And I was, as I was mentioning, I only live between Canby and Oregon City, and my access isn't brilliant all the time because everybody's online at the same time right now, and so capacity is a challenge, I think. But I think that'll be important, that we begin to meet that need. The need is really high right now in a lot of different categories, and the state will have a role to play in some of those. So I hate to ramble endlessly because I know people have questions. So I would pause right there, and I would love to take questions if you have them. Otherwise, I really can talk endlessly. So I don't want to encourage that myself.
Thank you very much, Representative Drazan. And we love to hear you talk. And we do have a small boatload of questions, which
Good.
Which our director, Sherry Henson, has been curating. And we have, however, we do have a hand up from an elected official. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that. Mayor Holladay, did you have a question?
Yeah, Representative Drazan. In fact, I just sent you a text to call me after I was curious about that last set of small business stuff that you're talking about. I know that my partner, Betty, she's a sole proprietor and has applied numerous times for the pandemic unemployment PUAC or whatever that is, and has been rejected every time. So when the state finally gets their act together, are they going to let her go back and claim those weeks?
So the pandemic unemployment assistance has only very recently come online from the perspective of the employment department. And so she would be eligible to be able to receive funding back to her original eligibility date. And I'd be more than happy to look into that for Betty to find out if she was rejected based on an eligibility issue or if the employment department, because they have been having a really hard time rejecting people who are eligible because this archaic system that they've got has some defaults in place. And so then a person has to go back in and manually correct. And that's really been a lot of the issues that they've been having, is the part of the systems that are automated sometimes help people get their benefits faster and sometimes really have slowed down access because the automated part of it sometimes is kicking people out when it shouldn't. So I'd be more than happy to help with that. But they have 100,000 people roughly who have applied for the PUA, and they are only right now beginning to process those claims. So the information that I received, I think it was in Raihana's packet from Regional Solutions, and I hope it was a typo, but it looked like that they were anticipating that process could take up to 36 weeks. And I hope I'm wrong, but I thought that that's what I read in there.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. Representative Drazan, if I could just interject. I actually asked Kay Erickson, the director of OED, about that as well. And she said it is in fact a typo and it's 3 to 4 weeks.
Much better, much better. I saw that and I was like, there's no way that it can go quite that long. So I'm pleased to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn this over to Sherry Henson. I have questions for each of the panelists, but I'm going to hold fire until, and then I have another one that was written in that Sherry may not have, but Sherry, would you like to start on some of these questions?
Yeah, you bet. And since we ended with Christine, we've got a couple of questions for you. This is coming from Nick Borowski. He's one of our directors on the board. Under California Senate Bill 939, the California legislature is considering allowing certain commercial tenants to take a rent moratorium for up to 1 year, then to cancel their leases if they cannot negotiate satisfactory new lease terms with their landlord. This would have a devastating impact on property owners, including pension fund investors, and on the ability of developers to finance and construct commercial real estate projects. All this would eventually reduce land and property values and ultimately impact the state's ability to create jobs. Are you aware of this move in California? And if so, what are your comments on the potential for such action in Oregon?
Thank you, Nick. It's good to hear from you. I am not following California as closely as I should be. And so I am stunned to hear that that is the path that they would take. I mean, when you start to look at how free markets work and how your commercial activity works, it's dependent on contracts. And once you start to have the state intervene and say, we're going to allow people to tear up certain contracts and ignore them, and leases don't mean what they used to mean, and we're going to pick and choose where the buck stops, and the level of accountability and responsibility right now is going to land where politicians say it should land, rather than where it would traditionally be. You work it out amongst the parties, and you renegotiate where you can, and you try to accommodate. But to have the state intervene in that way is really, really shocking to me. And you know how I was saying before, Mark McMullen was saying, don't do permanent damage to your economy. That seems to fly in the face of that. That seems like that would erode investors' willingness to engage in the market just moving forward, because there's no certainty. You
So
suddenly
support California.
are exposed. What was that? I'm
So
sorry.
you support California, right?
Right, right. Not entirely. But so I haven't heard of anything quite that extreme happening or being proposed in Oregon. And if it does, if that conversation begins to head that direction, I would hope that we would have our community and our business leaders, as well as our policymakers, calling for a more reasoned approach to that.
You bet. Thank you.
We have another question for Representative Drazan from Kim Foster. What is your take on the validity of the governor's extension of the emergency declaration without legislature convening, debating, and voting on it?
Yeah, good to hear from you, Kim. So I am not an attorney. I think I should begin every single presentation that way and let people know I'm not an attorney. But in this case, I think that the governor intentionally chose an emergency order and a pathway that would give her the most flexibility. And so I think that there is it's appropriate to say she likely should have chosen the public health emergency that was limited in duration. This is a public health event. But in fact, it appears she could have she chose multiple. She chose to announce this declaration under multiple statutes, and they are not entirely aligned for our requirements. And so we will have to wait and see what the judge says. As I understand it, the Baker County Circuit Court judge has till today to reconsider his original injunction.
Christine?
And then
Yeah, he's already ruled and said that he is sticking by his original order, and now it's going back to the Supreme Court.
So he's calling their bluff, and I think allowing them to take on their role of making a final determination in this. I think they probably would have preferred it if he would have reversed himself. And thank you, Dan, since he's chosen, I've been in too many meetings today. Since he's chosen not to do that, I think this is going to be a really interesting constitutional question for how they respond to this statutory question. I think that she should have done a short-term limited duration emergency declaration. That's my personal view. She should have called the legislature in. There's a role for the legislature. I think it's appropriate to have accountability and balance. It would have supported the response in a way that was less far-reaching. It would have been more tactical than she was able to do simply through executive orders. And so I would have preferred she did that, but I defer to the Supreme Court's ruling for how they choose to move forward.
Thank you, Christine. This question's coming from Chris Story. And out to the panelists, what degree of materiality will the state use when deciding between phases? In other words, if things are going well, can a county shift to phase 2 earlier than 21 days? If the indices are above the targets, but only by a little, how will the decision be made on whether to reinstate restrictions? So 2 questions there.
Sounds like a Raihana question.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I can start and then maybe Matthew can help fill in for me from OHA. So the 21-day period is a requirement. A county or region must stay in each phase for a minimum of 21 days. And they must meet the prerequisites again before advancing to the next phase. As far as the metrics that we don't want to trigger because we don't want to move back to an earlier phase, if those metrics are triggered, there won't be an automatic reversal. My understanding is that the Oregon Health Authority will consult with local public health to evaluate the situation in greater detail before determining the best path forward. Matthew, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you've mostly answered. I just add very quickly, I guess, that part of the 21 days is to make sure that we do have a verifiable, a pretty fairly clear trend to know that things are going well. And on the decisions about reinstating, it's also much of the emphasis is around working with local public health, working with local communities broader than just public health, to see what can they do if we start to see one of those rates inching up a little higher than we'd like, or not coming down fast enough in the case of some. For example, contact tracing getting to everyone. In several counties, those are actually already above the line, but we think it's primarily about kind of ramping up process rather than about the kind of the underlying kind of issue. But if it stays high, can we work with the local community? Can we figure out a way to address it? That would be much more desirable than simply clamping down restrictions again.
Thank you, Matthew and Raihana. This question's coming from Liz Hannum, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your last name incorrectly. I think this is going to Dan Holladay. Would Oregon City be interested in opening some of the regulations to allow things like parklets to increase capacity of restaurants?
I certainly would be, but once again, I don't have a majority on the city commission this time. So if the business community and the Oregon City community as a whole is willing to, is interested in that, they need to reach out to the other commissioners and encourage them to do that sort of thing.
Thank you, Dan. This question is coming from Trieste Andrews. When will care centers for visitation be reopened, even on a limited basis?
I think I can start with that one. This is Matthew Green with OHA. Maybe Raihana, you jump in if I leave something out. For visitation for both long-term care facilities like nursing homes and also for hospitals, that will probably almost certainly be one of the last restrictions to be removed. The concern is that if the virus gets into a nursing home, it can have truly tragic results. We have one case in Oregon where 29 people died because the virus got in. That case, that nursing home has actually been closed now, and all of the patients moved to other facilities. In fact, DHS opened up a couple of facilities to quarantine people. So that is such a high risk environment if the virus gets in, that sadly that kind of visitation is one of the most high risk activities that can be done, because anybody, even people who have no symptoms, may have the virus. We know that now. So that will be one of the last of the restrictions to be lifted.
Okay, thank you again, Matthew. This question's from Anton Brettel. If and when a vaccine is created, how will the state of Oregon work to redistribute the vaccine widely? And considering education efforts, taking note of skepticism towards immunizations in the US, the cost to individuals and access via different low income and at-risk communities.
think Raihana and I are looking at each other. Do you want to start?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't know the answer to it. I don't know, Matthew, if you have any insights. If not, I am happy to follow up with you, Sherry, afterward, and maybe you could then share that share that response with the member who's asked the question.
That is perfect.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I've not been part of those, but all of those are very much considerations, things that you mentioned.
And at this time, Mr. Gifford, we have no additional questions.
There is one down here from, I guess it's a comment. It's not so much a question.
Yep.
Did you want to read that from?
I'm just seeing one come in from James Graham. Is in this COVID-19 environment, how is workforce development being implemented?
Come on, Rob, you can figure this out.
He's looking like he wants to answer this.
Well, I do want to answer it. It's all done on the local level, you know, with the Clackamas Workforce Partnership, the workforce development department at the college. They all work hand in hand about response. So, you know, there's a plethora of, don't ask me to spell it, but there's a plethora of resources available to people. And that's why I shared those websites links with everybody, because you can just get in there and you can find out where you need. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things like resume preparation, interview stuff, alignment. We have various programs. Kent started talking about our career and technical stuff, where we have a new industrial tech center. Then some of the programs that we have to get people actually up to speed, mentorship programs, apprenticeship programs to help pay for people. There's just a lot of programs. And so if people just get on the websites and start looking for resources and then kind of reach out, you will find you'll find a lot of help.
Thank you, Rob.
Well, I did have a couple of questions, unless you wanted to read that last statement. Sherry, I guess I started with David Green.
From News Today.
Yes.
About a dozen states are seeing an uptick in new virus cases, bucking the national trend of staying steady or seeing decreases. And at least half of the states seeing more infections were part of an early wave of reopenings in late April and early May. Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee are among the states that have seen recent increases in newly reported cases several weeks after moving to reopen. Arkansas, North Dakota, and Oklahoma, which did not have statewide stay-at-home orders but began reopening businesses, are also reporting increases in new cases. Thank you, David Green.
That's not really a question, but
Nope, it's a comment.
Just a comment. So I think I have a question for Representative Drazan, and that I think it impacts business a lot, because we're talking about our future work sources, or our workforce. Our future workforce is, and in early May there was an essay in The Economist magazine that said that we should be opening up our schools first. And do you have a comment as to when we can get our schools reopened?
Yeah, thank you. I am also anxious to work that out. I know right now Department of Education is working really hard to try to envision what our K-12 system could look like reopened. And as you can imagine, as far as exposure, the issue has over time become less about the kids and more about the educators and the support staff and the possible exposure for people in that profession.
Older teachers.
Yeah, and all of us. And so I know that that navigating what education looks like next year has been a priority to try to get that worked out in the short term. So far, the the things that I have heard discussed don't yet pass muster for me for providing a robust, full return to a full education for our students. And I have been, even throughout this initial process, concerned about what the experience of distance learning has been like for our students. I'm a mom of 3, and my kids are not equally thriving in an online environment, and I would expect that's true for a lot of families. So I'm anxious to get this worked out. I know that they're working on it, but some of it becomes social distancing. You know, a classroom of kindergartners just is not realistic. They are 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and whatever. And that is, I think that's part of the challenge here, is how stringent will this look? What can this possibly look like realistically? How can we keep people safe? And so it has to be resolved. But I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps this is a question for Matthew. And I don't exactly know how to phrase this, but I'm interested in the historical comparisons. I hear so many people say what we are experiencing now is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and yet there have been previous pandemics. And have we been able to learn anything from the past of previous? I know that the technology has changed so much, you know, that every situation is different. But are we looking to see, is there something we can learn from previous pandemics?
That's a interesting way to phrase it. I haven't put a lot of thought into that yet, so I'm not really prepared with an answer. I can say that.
Well, don't let that stop you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know. So at this point, the closest comparison is it's probably closer to the 1918 flu than to, say, the H1N1 of just a few years ago, which that one it ended up with about, I want to say, 12,000 fatalities in the United States, the H1N1, about 10 years ago or less. There was the swine flu in the 70s, also had relatively few cases. I think in every one of these, getting out ahead of it is always important. The whole idea of flattening the curve came from lessons learned from previous situations, that preventing the spread as early as possible in that way is part of it. Once it starts going, it builds on itself. It becomes, you know, geometric progression of cases early on. And I think we have done that in this state. If you look at the epidemiological curve in the state, we're not as nearly as high as we could have been. And the sacrifice around a lot of, frankly, around businesses, around personal activities, one outcome of it is that the epi chart is now on a relatively low plateau as opposed to where it could be. That's the biggest lesson. Beyond that, we also know that these things aren't necessarily solved until there is a vaccine in place. If you think about something like influenza, if we had no influenza vaccines, would actually be probably much more significant. That comparing the statistics to an influenza case is a little tricky because there are a lot more people today who are resistant to it because they've had something in the past, and because a fairly substantial part of the population has been immunized. Or immunized, I guess, either naturally because they've had it in the past or because they got a vaccine this year. And we simply do not have that, which is one of the reasons for the big concern. Until we have that, there is going to be a concern around it coming back for anybody who has not yet acquired it. And frankly, we don't actually know yet how much immunization, how long-term, what kind of protection even having the case brings. There's an ongoing look at, is it possible for people to get it again? If so, how soon? There's just a lot of unknowns that we haven't answered there yet.
Thank you very much. We do have, I guess it's 1.5 questions that just came in, Sherry, but we're running out of time. So let's see if we can get this one answered relatively quickly. Sherry?
All righty. So David Buell is asking, what percentage in the 12 states increasing in reported cases are just from increased testing versus actual spread of the disease?
And it follows up with another part of that.
Okay, given the recent increases after reopening activities, which scenario is riskier? Slower reopening or reopening with multiple spikes and possible backtracking down the phases to stay at home?
So this is Matthew Green again. I don't know the specific cases, the specific information about the other states that are being referenced here. There is some degree that increased testing will find additional cases. Part of the question then becomes kind of a rate at which you're finding them. If you're finding additional cases at a very high rate, a positivity rate, sometimes referred to, it's become the jargon. If the percentage of cases that come back positive is high and stays high as you test more, or even if it gets higher, then you're finding new additional pockets or it's spreading further. If it starts to go lower, that's probably a good sign that your testing has simply is finding more people who have the disease, but the disease itself is not really growing. That happens to be the case in Oregon. As we do more testing, we are finding a lower positivity rate. We're finding more absolute number of cases, but the rate is dropping fast. Actually, it's down under 3% lately. On the other one, I'm not sure if I have a riskier answer to that one. It's certainly, we have taken the approach, I think it's safe to say that we have taken the approach of slower reopening, try to track things early, also try to have things like contact tracing and isolation capacity and hospital capacity in place. So if there is a spike that happens, those things exist in a way that they did not exist a few months ago, in a capacity level that did not exist a few months ago, to be able to respond very quickly. That has been the health strategy, and I believe the governor's strategy as well, to be prepared in case there is a spike, and then open cautiously in that regard.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. I popped up a little poll that we had created out there, and it looks as though we have dropped. We started off with close to 70 attendees. It looks like we're down to about 35 or so. So I appreciate everyone sticking around, and we will be able to take additional questions if you'd like to email them to membership@ocbusinessalliance.com. We finished our polling apparently into posting and share the results. So it looks as though most people felt that this was a pretty positive forum. I thank all the participants. Kent, did you have any parting words? Because we have run out of time.
Sure, William. I just wanted to thank each and every one of our panelists, Representative Drazan, Mayor Holladay, Raihana, Matthew, Dan, and Rob, for really explaining a lot of information for us. I was writing down, taking a lot of notes as we were going through all this. Obviously, each day we get more information that we can share amongst each other. I would just like to let everybody know, as the OCBA continues to have access to that information, we'll be sending out links to our members so they can connect into it. And then hopefully on Tuesday, June 23rd, we will all meet again in person at the Abernathy Center. We are honored to have Representatives Mark Meek and Christine Drazan as our speakers for that event to give us more updates that's taking place from the legislature. So put that on your calendar.
And we have another raised hand from Director Henson.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we thank our co-sponsors today, the City of Oregon City, the Oregon City Chamber, and Downtown Oregon City Association.
Yes, thanks to all. This is a vibrant community, and we plan on keeping it that way. Thank you all for being here. Without further ado, I'm going to end this session. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks.